Nolan Fitch hired a housekeeper the way he fixed a fence line. He found the problem, figured out the most direct solution, and got it done before the ground froze. He put a notice on the board at the co-op in Lacombe, Alberta in the second week of October. It said he needed someone to cook, clean and keep a 2-bedroom house on a working cattle ranch 40 kilometers east of town. The pay was fair. The work was not light. The nearest neighbor was 12 kilometers down a gravel road, and the winters were the kind that made people who had never lived through one reconsider everything they thought they knew about themselves. He did not put a phone number on the notice. He put a mailing address. He believed that people who could not write a letter were not people he wanted living in his house. What arrived 3 weeks later was a woman named Josephine Callard, who was 37 years old, 5'10", and had the particular quality of stillness that belongs either to people who are completely at peace or people who have decided not to waste energy on things that don't matter. In Josephine's case, it was the second one. I want to tell you about these two people, not because their story is unusual, but because it is the kind of story that happens quietly, on the edges of things, in places where nobody is watching, and it deserves to be told. Nolan Fitch was 41 years old and had been ranching the same quarter section of central Alberta land since he was 26. He had inherited it from his uncle, who had inherited it from his father, and the land had the quality of all inherited things. It came with history you didn't earn and obligations you didn't choose. 320 acres of mixed grass and poplar bush, 50 head of black Angus, a machine shed that needed a new roof, and a kitchen that had not been properly cleaned since his wife left 4 years ago. He was not a difficult man to understand. Once you accepted the fact that he was not going to help you understand him. He was tall, dark-haired, going gray at the temples, and moved through his days with the economical efficiency of someone who had learned early that the land did not care how you felt. It only cared what you did. He was up at 5:30 every morning. He was in bed by 9:30 every night. He spoke when he had something to say, and was quiet the rest of the time, which was most of the time, and he had long ago stopped noticing that this made other people uncomfortable. The woman who had left 4 years ago was named Patricia. She had grown up in Red Deer and thought ranching was a life she could want. She was wrong, and to her credit she figured this out before she made either of them too miserable about it. They had no children. They had parted without hatred, which Nolan considered the best possible outcome. He did not talk about her. He had not looked for anyone else. He had, instead, gotten very good at eating sandwiches and ignoring the layer of dust that had settled over the house like a second skin. The notice at the co-op was not a romantic gesture, it was a practical one. He had a torn rotator cuff that was making the physical work harder, and he could not also manage the house. He needed help. He was willing to pay for it. He did not expect to like whoever showed up. Josephine Callard had been living in Edmonton for the previous 6 years, working as an office manager for a small engineering firm. Before that, she had grown up outside of Wetaskiwin, the daughter of a grain farmer who believed that children should know how to work before they were allowed to know how to play. She could drive a tractor, read a soil report, patch drywall, and make a pot of soup out of whatever was left in the refrigerator on a Thursday night. She had a university degree in English literature, which she considered simultaneously the most useless and the most valuable thing about herself. She had left Edmonton because she had made the decision, very quietly and with no drama whatsoever, that she was done. Done with the city, done with the office, done with the particular exhaustion of spending 40 hours a week managing other people's problems, and coming home to an apartment that cost more than she wanted to think about. She was not having a crisis. She was making a correction. She saw Nolan's notice on the co-op board when she drove through Lacombe on her way to visit her cousin. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she took a photo of it with her phone, drove to her cousin's place, sat at the kitchen table, and wrote a letter. A real one by hand on paper she borrowed from her cousin's printer. The letter said she was 37, in good health, experienced in cooking and domestic management, and had grown up on a working farm and understood what that meant. She said she was not afraid of isolation. She said she wanted to be clear about one thing from the outset. She was applying for a job, not a situation, and she expected to be treated accordingly. She signed it with her full name. Nolan read the letter twice. He read it a third time. He had received 4 responses to his notice. The first 3 were exactly what he had expected. This one was not. He called the number she had written at the bottom of the letter. She answered on the second ring. He said he had some questions. She said that was fine, she had some too. He asked his questions, she answered directly. She asked her questions. He answered them, which surprised him, because he did not typically explain himself to people he hadn't met. They agreed on a start date. He told her the room was small but private with its own window. She said a window was all she needed. He said the pay was non-negotiable. She said she had not called to negotiate the pay. He said all right then. She said she would see him on the 14th. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a 12-year-old Subaru that had enough kilometers on it to suggest she was someone who went places. She had 2 bags and a wooden crate containing approximately 30 books, a cast iron skillet, and a portable shortwave radio. Nolan came out of the barn when he heard the car. She was already unloading the crate by the time he reached the yard. He said, "You brought your own pan," she said. "I've been burned by borrowed cookware before, literally." She lifted the crate without asking for help. "Which door?" He pointed to the side entrance. She nodded and carried the crate inside. He stood in the yard for a moment, not entirely sure what had just happened, and then went back to the barn. The first week was a calibration. Josephine learned the house the way she learned everything, systematically and without fuss. She found where things were kept, identified what was broken and made a list. Not for herself. She left the list on the kitchen counter under a coffee mug so Nolan would find it in the morning. It said, in order of urgencies, the seal on the mudroom door, the element on the back burner of the stove, and the water pressure in the bathroom sink. Nolan found the list. He looked at it for a long time. He fixed the mudroom seal that afternoon. She cooked without asking him what he liked. She made things that were warm and filling and did not require him to praise them. The first night was a beef and barley soup that used a pound of the stewing beef from his freezer and smelled like every good thing that had ever happened in a kitchen. He ate 2 bowls and said nothing. She did not seem to need him to. What she was not was invisible. This is what Nolan had not anticipated. He had imagined a quiet arrangement, someone who moved through the background of his days like furniture. Josephine was not furniture. She had opinions, expressed calmly and without apology, about the order in which the firewood should be stacked, about the way he was clearly favoring his left shoulder in a manner that was going to cause problems, and about the fact that he had not opened the curtains in the living room in so long that they had faded unevenly. She did not deliver these opinions as complaints. She delivered them as information. He found this unsettling in a way he could not immediately name. By the second week she had reorganized the pantry, fixed the back burner herself using a YouTube tutorial and a screwdriver she found in the junk drawer, and started a sourdough starter in a jar on the counter. He asked her what that was. She told him. He said he didn't know you could make bread from that. She said most people didn't, but it was one of those things that seemed complicated and was actually just a matter of patience. He did not reply. But the next morning he looked at the jar before he left for the barn. The shoulder was the first real thing between them. Not romantic, practical, but real. He had been rotating his arm in a particular way when he thought no one was watching. The way people do when something hurts, and they are trying to determine privately how much. Josephine had watched this for 4 days before she said anything. She said, "The rotator cuff thing, is it the supraspinatus or the infraspinatus?" He looked at her. He said, "What?" She said, "I grew up watching my father refuse to see a doctor until things were unsalvageable. I recognized the pattern. Which muscle?" He said he didn't know the specific name. She asked him to describe where it hurt. He did, grudgingly and in as few words as possible. She went and got a bag of frozen peas from the freezer, wrapped it in a dish towel, and told him to put it on the back of his shoulder, not the front, for 20 minutes after he came in at night. She said the physiotherapist in Lacombe was named Kira Swanson, and that she had checked the website, and there was an opening on Thursday morning. He said he didn't need her to book his appointments. She said, "I'm not booking it. I'm telling you it's there." She put the peas in his hand and went back to what she was doing. He went to the Thursday appointment. He did not mention this to Josephine. She did not ask. But on Thursday evening, there were cinnamon buns on the counter, warm, which she had not made before. And he understood without either of them saying anything that she had done this on purpose. He ate 2 of them standing at the counter in his coat, still cold from outside, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. The sense of being quietly looked after. November came with the first proper cold, and the kind of silence that descends on the Alberta parkland, when the snow muffles everything and the world reduces itself to whatever is within the walls where you are. Josephine did not seem to mind this. She had her books, her shortwave radio, and what appeared to be an inexhaustible capacity for her own company. On evenings when Nolan came in from checking the cattle, he would find her at the kitchen table with a book or bent over a piece of paper, writing in longhand. He asked once what she was writing. She said she was making notes. He asked about what. She said, "Things I notice." He left it at that, but he thought about it later, lying in bed listening to the wind work its way around the eaves. Things she noticed. He wondered what ended up in those notes. He suspected he would not want to know. The cold snap in November was the kind that tested everything. -38 with the wind. The kind of temperature that turned the world into something that could hurt you if you let it. 3 of the calves he had moved to the near pasture needed to be brought in, and the tractor had a block heater problem that meant it took 45 minutes of standing in the dark before it started properly. He came in after midnight, frost on his collar, and found Josephine up. She was at the stove. She did not look up when he came through the door. She said, "How many?" He said, "3, they're in the pen." He sat down to pull his boots off. His hands were not working properly. She put a mug in front of him. Tea, very strong, which was not what he usually drank, but it was what was in the mug, and it was hot, and that was the only thing that mattered at that moment. Then she sat down across from him and said, "Your hands, can you feel your fingers?" He said yes, barely. She picked up his left hand and pressed it between both of hers, which were warm because she had been standing at the stove. She did not make a thing of it. She pressed his hand like it was a practical matter, which it was, and she held it until the feeling came back enough that he could bend his fingers properly. Then she did the other one. He looked at the table while this was happening. He did not know where else to look. He was aware of her hands, her patience, the particular quality of her attention, which was total and entirely undemonstrative, and something moved through him that he was not prepared for. She said, "You should get a better pair of liners, the ones you have are rated to -20, he said. "I know." His voice was different, he could hear it himself. She let go of his hands, she went back to the stove, she didn't say anything else, neither did he. But something had shifted, the way the snow shifts on a roof before it decides whether to slide. December arrived, and with it the particular quiet of a house that is waiting for something. Nolan was not a man who marked time. He had no traditions, no rituals, nothing that distinguished one December from the next except the length of the days and the weight of the work. He had spent the last 4 Christmases doing nothing. Not as a sad thing, simply as a fact. On the morning of December 23rd, he came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen. Josephine had not gone to town. He had assumed without asking that she would spend the holiday with family. She had not said otherwise, but here she was, and here was the kitchen changed. Not with purchased decorations, there was none of that. What there was, dried rosehips from the bush along the fence line, which she must have cut weeks ago without him noticing, hung in a cluster from the light above the table. Sprigs of poplar, bare and white, arranged in an old milk jug that had been sitting on the back porch, since he couldn't remember when. And on the table a plate of shortbread cookies cut into the shapes of cattle and trees, which was either coincidental or deliberate, and either way was perfect. He stood in the doorway for a long time. She came out of the back room and saw him standing there. She did not say anything about the decorations. She said, "There's coffee," he said. "You didn't go home." She said, "This is where I live right now." He looked at the rosehips and the poplar branches and the plate of cattle-shaped shortbread, and something cracked open in him that had been sealed for 4 years. He did not make a sound. It was entirely internal, but it was the kind of opening that does not close again afterward. He said, "My grandmother was from Saskatchewan. She used to say something in Cree when we came in from the cold. I never learned what it meant. I was too young. But I remember the sound of it, and I remember that it meant you were safe." He stopped. He had not planned to say that. He had not in fact planned to say anything. "I don't know why." I looked at him steadily. She said, "In French we say chez soi. It means at home with yourself, in yourself." She paused. "My mother used it to describe a feeling, not a place." They were standing on opposite sides of the kitchen table with a plate of shortbread between them. They did not move toward each other. They didn't need to. Something had been said that could not be unsaid. Something had been understood. He poured himself a coffee. She sat down with her tea. They ate shortbread at the kitchen table while the wind pressed itself against the windows, and the cattle in the pen were quiet, and the land outside was white and still and absolutely enormous. The way Alberta land is enormous, which is to say incomprehensibly, and neither of them felt the size of it the way they usually did. That was the morning he knew. He would not say so for a long time. He was not a man who said things quickly, but he knew. What happened next happened slowly, which is the only way things should happen when they are the kind of things that are meant to last. In January, Josephine started coming out to help with the evening check on the cattle. Not because she had been asked, because she had noticed, without saying so, that he found it easier when there were 2 sets of eyes. Especially in the dark. She borrowed his older parka and a pair of insulated boots that she found in the mudroom, and she learned which animals were which by temperament rather than by tag number, which he did not expect. She learned that the heifer in the east pen was nervous around sudden movement. She learned that the big Angus bull he called Dunbar, for reasons he had never explained to anyone, had a habit of pressing his forehead against the gate when he wanted attention, which was regularly. She said one evening, while they were breaking ice on the water trough, "Dunbar has a lot of feelings for a bull," Nolan said, without looking up. "He's always been like that." She said, "It's not a criticism." He said, "I know." She said, "I think it's one of his better qualities." He did look up then. She was chipping at the ice with entirely too much focus, the way people look when they are trying not to smile. He went back to the water, but he was smiling too, privately at his end of the trough. In February he fixed the curtains in the living room. Not because anyone had asked him to. He took them down, ran them through the wash, hung them back up on a cold afternoon, when the light was very white and flat across the snow. Josephine came in from town when he was still on the stepladder and looked at the curtains, and then at him and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "They look better." He said, "They were bothering me." She said, "Were they?" He said, "For a while." This was, for Nolan Fitch, approximately the equivalent of a declaration. Spring came late to central Alberta, the way it always does, reluctantly and with setbacks. There were 2 more cold snaps in March, a week of freezing rain in April that was genuinely miserable for everyone, and then one morning in early May the light shifted, and the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes, and the smell of the land came through. That particular smell of wet earth and grass returning that is one of the best smells in the world, if you have spent enough winters missing it. Josephine was leaning on the top rail of the fence when he came to find her that morning. She was looking at the pasture where the cattle had moved out for the first time since October, moving slowly through the grass that was just starting to come. He stood beside her. They watched the cattle. After a while he said, "The east pasture needs the fence checked before we move anyone over." She said, "I know, I walked it yesterday. There are 3 posts on the north side that need replacing." He looked at her. She was still watching the cattle. He said, "When did you walk the fence?" She said, "When you were in Lacombe for your appointment, it needed doing." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I wanted to know the land." He looked back at the pasture. He said, "It takes a while to know it." She said, "I know." She did not say anything else, but what she meant and what he understood was that she was not planning to stop learning it, that she was not in a hurry, that she intended to be here long enough to know all of it, the difficult parts and the beautiful ones. He did not say anything. He was not a man who said things. He stood beside her on the fence rail for a long time, watching his cattle move through the first grass of the new season, and he felt something that he had stopped expecting to feel. The sense that the future was not something to be endured, but something that might, possibly, be looked forward to. He asked her in June. Not dramatically. He asked her over the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning, with the kind of directness that was the only directness he knew. He said, "I'd like this to be a different kind of arrangement." He picked up his coffee cup. "If that's something you'd consider." Josephine looked at him. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Different how?" He said, "Permanent." She said, "Permanent meaning marriage?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Or permanent meaning you just want me to stay indefinitely without having to figure out what to call it?" He said, "Marriage." She looked at him for another moment. She said, "I have 2 conditions." He said, "I assumed you would." She said, "The shortwave radio stays. And I want a proper desk in the back room. A real one, not the folding table." He said, "The desk I can do this week. The radio was never going anywhere." She said, "Then yes." They were married in September on a Saturday in the yard of the ranch, with his neighbor Art Kowalski as witness, and a justice of the peace who drove out from Lacombe, and said she had done a lot of ceremonies in a lot of places, and this was one of her favorites on account of the setting. The cattle were in the near pasture and could be seen from where they stood. Josephine wore a blue dress she had bought in Wetaskiwin. Nolan wore his good jacket and had, for the first time in recent memory, pressed his collar. Art Kowalski, who was 73 and had known Nolan since he was in his 20s, said afterward that he had never seen Nolan look like that, and could not find a better word for it than present. Like he was entirely there, in the moment for the first time in as long as Art could remember. Nolan Fitch and Josephine Callard ranched the quarter section outside of Lacombe for many years afterward. The cattle herd grew to 90 head. The fence along the east pasture was replaced in full the autumn after they married. The desk in the back room was a proper one. Pine with 2 drawers and enough surface area for books and notebooks, and the particular kind of quiet work that Josephine had been doing all her life. The shortwave radio sat on the kitchen windowsill, and was used on weekend evenings, especially in winter, when the reception was clearest and the stations from far places came in with a kind of intimacy that radio had in the days before everything was streaming. Nolan learned over time to sit with it, to listen. He was not a person who had ever been given to music or radio or the particular pleasure of sound for its own sake. But he learned it from her, the way you learn things from people who live patiently alongside you, and don't require you to arrive fully formed. The sourdough starter survived. It was still going years later, fed weekly, still in the same jar. I have told you this story the way it happened, quietly, without ceremony, in the kind of place where people often disappear into the work and come out the other side not knowing what they've built until they look back. Nolan Fitch did not go looking for a life. He posted a notice on a board at the co-op in Lacombe because he needed help with the house. Josephine Callard did not go looking for a life either. She saw a notice on a board and wrote a letter by hand because something in her recognized the shape of what was being offered. Neither of them was expecting anything except what had been agreed to, and what they got was entirely, absolutely, and completely something else. That is how the best things happen in my experience. Not when you plan for them, when you are honest about what you need, and someone else is honest about what they have, and between the 2 of you, something is built that neither one could have built alone. I'll ask you what I always ask. What was the moment for you, when you knew it was more than an arrangement? Was it the frozen peas? The curtains? The cattle-shaped shortbread? The fence walked alone on a Tuesday afternoon? Tell me. Because the best part of telling these stories is hearing which moment stays with you.